Hey everyone, welcome into some Entitled People stories. Today we've got 3 tales of people who thought they could push, demand, and manipulate without consequences. One involves a neighbor who reversed into a parked car and then argued about car seats. Another, a manager who demanded sunrise to sunset reports and got exactly that. And the last, a temp supervisor who called the wrong person lazy in front of 100 guests. Here we go. The crunch and the dark, how a shared driveway dispute ended with my car totaled. This happened about 5 years ago and still gets brought up at family dinners whenever someone mentions difficult neighbors. My in-laws lived in a quiet little row of houses with a shared driveway arrangement. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. They and the previous neighbors had an understanding. If someone needed to get in or out, there'd be a bit of musical chairs with the cars, maybe a quick knock on the door, and everyone got on with their day. Then the old neighbors moved out, and the house was bought by a young squatty. He was a British infantryman, and at first my in-laws were optimistic. He was gone for months at a time on deployment, so when he was away, it was blissfully quiet. When he was home, however, he treated the shared driveway like it was a personal runway. He'd block the drive entirely, then take his time answering the door if my in-laws knocked to get out. It wasn't a polite 2-minute shuffle of keys and apology. It was 10 minutes of knocking, waiting, and sometimes knocking again. During his renovation phase, delivery trucks and contractors would park right across the access point, like the concept of shared had never crossed their minds. The driveway, which had once been a minor coordination effort, turned into a daily obstacle course. The worst part was the incline. The drive stretched about 30 meters up a fairly steep slope and had no lighting. In summer, it was inconvenient. In winter, it was downright dangerous. My in-laws were getting older, and climbing that incline in the dark because someone had decided to park like a selfish idiot wasn't just annoying, it was a genuine risk. One winter evening, I drove over to pick up my kids from my in-laws. It was already dark by 4 in the afternoon, one of those gray days that bleeds into night without warning. The driveway was clear when I arrived, and I assumed the squatty was deployed again. I parked partway up the drive, making sure I wasn't obstructing access, and went inside to bundle up my toddler and baby. A few minutes later, we heard a loud crunch from outside, not a gentle bump, not a scraping noise, a proper stomach-dropping metallic crunch. I handed the baby to my mother-in-law and ran out the door. There he was, halfway up the driveway in his car, nose buried into the rear of mine. He'd reversed up the incline at speed in the dark and hadn't seen my vehicle. My car wasn't completely destroyed, but the rear end was badly damaged. His first words weren't, "Are you okay?" or "I didn't see you." They were, "Why have you blocked my drive?" I stared at him for a second, trying to process the audacity. "It's a shared drive," I said, "and you just reversed into my parked car." He muttered something about not wanting it to go through insurance and insisted he'd cover the damage himself. "Let's just sort it out privately," he said. "No need to get insurance involved." He caused the accident, and his first instinct was to blame you for being parked there on a shared drive in the dark while he reversed at speed? That's not a mistake. That's a pattern of entitlement finally catching up with him. At that point, I was willing to be reasonable. Accidents happen, even stupid ones. I got a repair quote and rang him a few days later. He was agreeable about paying for the bodywork until I mentioned the car seats. In the UK, it's strongly advised that child car seats be replaced after any collision because the structural integrity can be compromised even if there's no visible damage. The moment I said that, he exploded. "You're taking the pee," he snapped. "That's just you trying to rinse me." I felt my temper spike. You reversed at speed up an unlit incline without checking if the drive was clear, I shot back. My kids could have been standing there. My in-laws could have been halfway up that slope, and you're arguing about car seats? He hung up on me. That was the end of my willingness to keep it friendly. I called my insurer and explained everything, gave them his details and let them handle it. They didn't blink. First thing they authorized was the replacement of both child seats. Then, after assessing the damage properly, they decided the car was a write-off. I received the full market value for it, which was more than enough to put towards something newer and safer. Meanwhile, his insurer got involved, and I imagine the conversation on his end was far less pleasant. His premiums went up, and there was no escaping that official record of fault. There was no quiet handshake agreement, no "we'll just sort it between us," just paperwork, liability, and the consequences of driving like an idiot. When I got my new car, I made a point of parking on that shared drive whenever I visited, perfectly legally, properly positioned, and with the hazard lights on for good measure. The first time he saw it blinking there in the dusk, he looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. I smiled sweetly and said, "Just making sure you can see it this time." He never admitted fault directly, but he stopped reversing up that drive at speed. He also stopped blocking it as often. Funny how insurance involvement can sharpen someone's sense of spatial awareness. My in-laws eventually moved, but for the remainder of their time there, the driveway incidents reduced dramatically. Every so often, when someone mentions difficult neighbors, I think about that crunch in the dark and the way he tried to blame me for parking legally on a shared access. If he'd just apologized and handled it properly, it would have cost him far less in the long run. Instead, he chose to argue over car seats and ended up funding my upgrade. And every time I flicked those hazard lights on, it felt like a small, glowing reminder that some lessons are learned the expensive way. And our second story. From sunrise to sunset, you will report everything. So I did. About 10 years ago, I landed what I thought was my golden ticket. After a decade of blue-collar work and putting myself through university the hard way, I finally secured an internship in a corporate HR office. I'd just come off a serious back injury the year prior and somehow managed to drag myself through my final year of school while recovering. To say I was grateful for a climate-controlled office would be an understatement. I would have kissed the air conditioning vent if that wouldn't have been considered unprofessional. The manager I worked under, however, could best be described as an old-school battle axe with a personality like sandpaper. Her reputation preceded her. I was told in hushed tones that nobody lasted more than a year under her supervision. She churned through staff like the copier burned through toner cartridges. I figured I'd just keep my head down, work hard, and endure. From the very first day, I was on her radar. I was on medication that affected my short-term memory because of a previous concussion, something she was fully aware of. I occasionally made minor typing mistakes, but I always ran spell check and carefully proofread everything before submitting it. She treated each small error as if I'd personally set fire to the company archives. A misplaced comma might result in a 15-minute reprimand about attention to detail. Her fixation wasn't limited to my typing. One afternoon, she delivered a full hour lecture on professionalism because I wore a blue shirt instead of a white one. Another time, I wore a sweater to a client meeting because their office heating had failed and it was minus 20 degrees Celsius outside. I got yelled at for the sweater harder than I'd ever been yelled at on any construction site I'd worked. Every day in that office felt like slowly inhaling glass shards. Then came the instruction that finally snapped something in me. She called me into her office and told me that from now on I would deliver a daily oral report on every client file I managed. Not a summary, not bullet points. She wanted every number, every email, every phone call recited from memory. If I misquoted even a single word from a transcript, I was not fit to be there. Her exact phrasing was, "From the moment the sun rises on this office to the moment it sets, you are to report everything that happens in these reports." She knew about my memory issues. She knew that demanding verbatim recall was unrealistic and overwhelming. That was precisely the point. I went home that night exhausted, but instead of panicking, I decided to treat her directive exactly as she had phrased it. If she wanted everything that happened from sunrise to sunset, she was going to get everything. She painted herself into a corner with that one. Everything from sunrise to sunset, she wanted to break you. But instead, she gave you permission to document every single thing. The sweater lecture, the coffee brew time, all of it. I opened Excel and began building a log. I wrote down every action, every movement, every keystroke. I documented the time I arrived, which hand I used to open the office door, how long the coffee machine ran. I practiced reciting it aloud until I could deliver it without hesitation. If precision was what she demanded, precision was what I would provide. The next morning, she summoned me to her office for my inaugural report. I stood in front of her desk, notebook in hand, and began calmly, walked from my car to the building at 8:52 a.m., opened the office door with my right hand, moderate pressure, entered the building, greeted the receptionist with "Good morning," proceeded to kitchen area, inserted coffee pot into Keurig, brew time 25 seconds. She blinked, but said nothing. I continued, sat at desk, adjusted chair height by approximately 1 inch, powered on computer, logged into system, opened Excel, began typing reports, ensuring keyboard noise remained within acceptable volume to avoid disturbing senior management arriving approximately 45 minutes after 9. She tried to interrupt me at one point, raising a hand as if to cut me off. I gently said, "You asked me to report everything that happens from sunrise to sunset." So I kept going. I detailed each client file update, each internal email, the exact phrasing used in phone calls, even the fact that I paused to take a sip of water at 10:17 a.m. The recital stretched nearly an hour. Her expression shifted from smug expectation to visible discomfort. By the time I finished, she was staring at me like I'd just delivered a monologue from a courtroom drama. She sat through an hour of her own medicine. Every minor detail, every breath, every chair adjustment. She wanted to watch you struggle to remember. Instead, she got a performance that left her no room to criticize. You followed the rules exactly. She didn't repeat the instruction the next day. A week later, I was called into HR. Yes, even HR has its own HR. They asked me to explain what had happened. I calmly described her directive word for word and presented my documentation. By that point, I'd been recording everything happening in that office, including the lectures about shirt colors and sweaters. They reviewed the situation and agreed that the expectations placed on me were unreasonable. I was transferred to another department within a month. The atmosphere there was markedly different, and for the first time since starting the internship, I felt like I could breathe without flinching. 3 months later, that department's manager resigned, and I was laid off as part of a restructuring. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't catastrophic either. Despite everything, I left with a solid reference from the second department head. The Battle Axe manager avoided me entirely after the transfer. I later heard she continued cycling through staff as she always had. As for me, I eventually left HR altogether and moved into a different field. Looking back, that morning recital remains one of the strangest moments of my career. I didn't yell, I didn't argue, I simply followed her instructions exactly as given. If she wanted a sunrise to sunset account of everything that happened, I was more than prepared to provide it in excruciating detail. Sometimes compliance speaks louder than protest, especially when you give someone precisely what they asked for. And our last story. Karen called me lazy in front of 100 guests, then got arrested. A few years ago, when I was 26, I was working as an operations manager for one of the largest HR companies in our region. We handled staffing for major corporate events, and that particular month we were running a huge congress that had drawn thousands of guests. I was in charge of roughly 400 temporary workers, most of them university students picking up part-time shifts. It was the kind of assignment where you don't sit down for 12 hours straight and your phone never stops vibrating. On the first morning of the event, I gathered everyone into one of the auditoriums for a full briefing. I spent over 30 minutes explaining how the schedules worked, who reported to whom, escalation protocols, and most importantly, that any changes to the official rota had to go through my office. With daily payroll, accuracy in scheduling wasn't optional. One small change could impact hundreds of payments. I scanned the room as I spoke and saw mostly attentive faces, though I later learned at least one person either wasn't present or wasn't listening. 2 weeks earlier, a new supervisor had joined the company. I'll call her Lucy. She was 27 and had been assigned a small team of about 10 workers. Nothing unusual there, but by midday of the Congress, I started receiving complaints that she was bossing people around outside her authority, ordering other supervisors to shift staff around, and generally acting like she ran the whole operation. At first, I assumed it was a misunderstanding. Big events create stress, and sometimes people overstep without realizing it. Still, the number of complaints kept increasing, so I headed toward the area she was managing to see what was actually going on. Before I even reached her station, she marched directly toward me. In front of about 100 guests and staff, she pointed at me and said loudly, "You're one of the laziest workers here. If you listened to my instructions, things would actually run properly." The noise in the room dipped just enough for people nearby to hear her tone. It wasn't just assertive, it was condescending. For a split second, I thought she was joking. She wasn't. The audacity of calling the ops manager lazy in front of a crowd, then demanding coffee while threatening their job? Some people really don't check who they're talking to. I kept my voice calm and said, let's step into a meeting room and discuss how I can improve. I'll admit there was more than a little sarcasm in that sentence. She agreed without hesitation, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. Once inside the room, she dropped into a chair, leaned back, and said, before we start, give me a coffee and hurry up. This conversation might decide your future here. I actually laughed out loud. I walked out, grabbed a coffee from the catering area, and returned to the room just to see how far this performance would go. When I re-entered, I noticed someone else inside, one of our department managers, a 34-year-old named Marco. The look on his face was priceless. He knew exactly who I was and what position I held, but Lucy apparently had not done that homework. She launched into a 15-minute lecture about how I should meet her boyfriend, who was in charge of everything here. She claimed he had influence over the Congress and could make or break careers. Marco sat silently, glancing at me like he was watching a slow-motion car crash. I let her finish without interrupting, curious how deep this would go. When she finally paused, I nodded seriously and said, "You're absolutely right. I'm very sorry for my behavior." I then turned to Marco and added, "Please don't fire me." I left the room without another word, which only seemed to fuel her confidence. As soon as I stepped outside, I called my assistant and told her to bring Lucy and her boyfriend to my office. Unfortunately, I was pulled away by an urgent call from the CEO. One of our primary clients needed immediate clarification on staffing numbers, so I had to leave the Congress Center for about 30 minutes. When I returned and entered my office, I immediately saw something that made my stomach drop. Lucy and her boyfriend were sitting at my computer. They weren't browsing casually, they were actively changing the digital work schedules of our 400 temporary staff members. Our company pays employees daily, and the schedule system is the primary record used for payroll calculation. If someone altered shifts or removed hours, it could redirect thousands of dollars. I didn't say a word. I stepped out and called security. When security entered, Lucy's boyfriend tried to act offended, claiming they had permission to review operations. We locked the computer and began checking what had been changed. The numbers were staggering. Based on the modifications they'd started, they were attempting to redirect or erase nearly $32,000 worth of daily wages from student workers. It was blatant fraud. We contacted the police immediately. While waiting, I sat across from them with the same coffee Lucy had demanded earlier. She no longer looked confident. Her boyfriend kept insisting it was a misunderstanding, that he was just testing the system. The police arrived quickly, reviewed the evidence, and took both of them into custody. During the search, they also found illegal substances in her purse, which added to their list of problems. Later investigations confirmed everything: the attempted payroll manipulation, unauthorized access to company systems, and possession charges sealed their fate. They both received prison sentences. I didn't have to engineer anything or trap anyone. They did all the work themselves. To this day, it remains one of the most surreal days of my career. I started that morning running logistics for 400 staff members and ended it watching two people escorted out in handcuffs for trying to steal from students. The irony is that Lucy had wanted to lecture me about professionalism and authority. Instead, she and her boyfriend provided a masterclass in how not to handle either. Every time I think about that coffee, I still laugh. She asked me to hurry because it would decide my future. In a way, she was right. It just wasn't my future that got decided that afternoon. Let's talk about who really won. Story one was the cost of cheapness. The squatty could have apologized, paid for the repairs, and moved on. Instead, he argued about child seats, hung up, and let insurance handle it. The result? A written-off car, a payout big enough to upgrade, and a neighbor who now parks carefully every time those hazard lights blink. Story two was paperwork as shield. The manager demanded impossible recall, knowing about the OP's memory issues, so the OP documented everything. The result? A transfer, a quiet exit from her orbit, and the satisfaction of watching her sit through her own impossible standard. But story 3 wins, not because of the money, though $32,000 in attempted fraud is staggering, but because of the stack. She called him lazy in public, demanded coffee like a servant, claimed her boyfriend ran everything, then walked into his office and started changing payroll for 400 students. The result? Security, police, illegal substances found, and prison sentences. She wanted to decide his future. She decided her own instead. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.